Prime Minister Modi's United States visit continues to be our special focus. On the one hand, there have been 12 standing ovations as the Prime Minister addressed the US Congress. On the other hand, the democracy question did follow him and Joe Biden right into the White House and has been the subject of much commentary in the US media. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo story. In a few moments from now, our newsmaker on the program today will be Salvatore Babones. He's, of course, a political analyst and commentator who has long questioned the Western consensus on what has sometimes been called the democratic backsliding of India. Now, irrespective of which side of this debate you're on, and it is a subject that the Modi government has typically ignored, it was an issue that followed the Prime Minister into the White House. At the joint press meeting of both leaders, a question was posed by a reporter of the Wall Street Journal. This as 70 lawmakers also urged the Biden administration to embrace India, but also bring up issues of rights, democracy, and the rights of religious minorities with the Prime Minister. At the other end of the spectrum, the Prime Minister received 12 standing ovations in a speech where he widely referenced the success of the Indian American community. Remember, Modi has been a state guest by the Biden, or rather of the Biden administration, the only third world leader to be hosted in this way by the Biden administration. The previous two were the leaders of France and South Korea. How do we look at everything that's taken place in the last 48 hours? Let's introduce our guest on the program today. Salvatore is with us. It's a pleasure to see you again on the program. You have, of course, met with the Prime Minister one-on-one when he was in Australia, and he described you as somebody who's become quite a popular name in India. There it says, "Howdy Modi," and then the Prime Minister goes on to tweet that you have, of course, become a popular name in India. You also often find yourself at the heart of what has come to be known as India's democracy debates. So I think we're going to have an interesting conversation today, Salvatore. Let me start by asking you, what's the big takeaway for you as you look at what's happened in the United States? It's almost like two different narratives, what the government is saying and what spaces of the non-government are saying in America.
The biggest takeaway is that even the pro-India government narrative is not so pro-India. And I think that's something that Indians should be aware of. There's been an embrace of India.
Explain that.
Oh, sure. When Jake Sullivan, or for that matter, the U.S. National Security Advisor, or for that matter, when the president himself talked about questions about Indian democracy and human rights in India, the response was that this is something for India to work on, not something that we would lecture India about. And it almost seems like they're taking Dr. Jaishankar's talking notes on this, saying that they're essentially conceding the ground. They're saying that, well, there are all these activist concerns about India. We're not going to rebut them. Implicitly, they're accepting them. But we are going to say that it's none of our business. Now, I think a much more positive narrative would have been if anyone in the leadership in the U.S., whether it's Congress or the Oval Office, if anyone in leadership in the U.S. had actually said, no, in fact, India scores well on human rights. No, in fact, we believe in Indian democracy. If they had presented a positive message, I would have been much more impressed. But if you read carefully, if you parse what they're saying, they never endorse Indian democracy, except in the most general terms. India is the world's largest democracy. We two great democracies stand together. I mean, that generic language is there. But in terms of specifically endorsing liberalism in India, instead of specifically rebutting the accusations made against India, they're pretty much just saying it's not our business. And I think that is that's an unfortunate outcome here. There was an opportunity here for a real embrace, and instead there was almost well, don't ask us about that.
That's interesting. You're actually saying that given that the Biden administration did not actually come out and praise the record of India on human rights, on pluralism, on democracy, you believe it fell short of being completely pro-India.
Oh, yes. I mean, look, let's just look at some simple facts. All of the writing I've been doing the last few months about the status of Muslims in India, status of Christians in India, is all based on American data coming from the Pew Research Center, which is right there in Washington, D.C. I have never heard any of that data cited by a mainstream U.S. source. And in fact, my own op-eds attempting to pitch them to U.S. newspapers were all rejected. Now, Jake Sullivan and the president have access to the whole Central Intelligence Agency, this massive data gathering organization that's supposed to feed intelligence to the president with a daily briefing. Now, Joe Biden should be getting the briefing that American research, not Indian research, not the Indian government, American research shows that, well, for example, Muslims face a lower level of self-reported discrimination in India than any minority group in the United States. That Christians report a lower level of discrimination in India than any minority group in the United States. I mean, those kind of facts are things that should be foregrounded. I've been talking about them. I'm aware of them. They're out there in the public domain. Why are we hearing them being cited? Why don't we hear a specific rebuttal?
Okay, before we come to what the Americans could have done, there are also other statistics. For example, the BJP, arguably amongst the most powerful political parties in recent memory in India, does not have presently a single Muslim member of parliament in the Lok Sabha. Right, that's just a fact, and it has often underrepresented Muslims in ticket distribution. When it does give tickets, those candidates don't actually do well. There is rhetoric that is made by leaders who are seen to be close to the BJP that is patently anti-Muslim. So, what I'm saying is that we can put that data out too of the absence of Muslim representation, not a single Muslim BJP member of parliament in the Lok Sabha.
Oh, I'd love to see a debate based on facts. So I'd love to see a more specific debate where, okay, if not the president himself, certainly his national security advisor, certainly journalists at places like the Wall Street Journal, and we can talk about the Wall Street Journal at the news briefing yesterday. These people should at least be saying in a more specific way, look, we have evidence that ordinary Muslims are very happy in India. And I'm sorry if that jars Indian audiences, but that's what the survey data tell us absolutely clearly. However, there seems to be a problem of Muslim representation. We'd love to see more work done about bringing Muslims into the mainstream of Indian society, which is also true. And this is something I've said right from the beginning. My very first headline performance in India, I stressed that there were very few Muslims in the audience. And why is that? Because Muslims are a socially excluded group in India, and more work needs to be done on the social inclusion of Muslims. Now, that is a much more detailed, specific, and a fairer narrative. It would be like telling the United States, we'd like to see more women in Congress. Well, we'd like to see more women in Congress is different from saying we're concerned about the human rights of women in America. Those are two very different narratives. And I think having a more fact-based discussion about India. Again, I'm not expecting Joe Biden personally to have this discussion, but I do expect his staff, I do expect especially journalists to be having this discussion, and we're just not seeing it. Instead, they're accepting this broad view that India violates human rights, but there are human rights violators, kind of in the same way that, maybe Saudi Arabia violates human rights, but they're an American ally, so we accept them anyway. That's not the sort of debate we should be having about India.
Well, Biden did say, a couple of times that democracy was a shared value. That found reference in the joint statement as well. But let's actually look at that Wall Street Journal question to both Biden and the Prime Minister. I want to play out what the Prime Minister said when he was specifically asked about, the rights of religious minorities, the rights of Muslims, discrimination, perceived discrimination against them in India. Let's listen in.
Mr. Prime Minister, India has long prided itself as the world's largest democracy, but there are many human rights groups who say that your government has discriminated against religious minorities and sought to silence its critics. As you stand here in the east room of the White House, where so many world leaders have made commitments to protecting democracy, what steps are you and your government willing to take to improve the rights of Muslims and other minorities in your country and to uphold free speech?
मुझे आश्चर्य हो रहा है कि आप कह रहे हैं कि लोग कहते हैं नहीं, भारत डेमोक्रेसी है। और जैसा राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन ने कहा, भारत और अमेरिका दोनों के डीएनए में लोकतंत्र है। लोकतंत्र हमारा स्पिरिट है, लोकतंत्र हमारी रगों में है, लोकतंत्र को हम जीते हैं और हमारे पूर्वजों ने उसको शब्दों में ढाला है संविधान के रूप में। और हमारी सरकार लोकतंत्र के मूलभूत मूल्यों को आधार लेकर के बने हुए संविधान के आधार पर चलती है। और हमारा संविधान और हमारी सरकार, और हमने सिद्ध किया है डेमोक्रेसी कैन डिलीवर। और जब मैं डिलीवर कहता हूं तब कास्ट, क्रीड, रिलीजन, जेंडर, किसी भी भेदभाव को वहां जगह नहीं होती है। और जब हम लोकतंत्र की बात करते हैं तब अगर ह्यूमन वैल्यूज नहीं है, ह्यूमैनिटी नहीं है, ह्यूमन राइट्स नहीं है, फिर तो वो डेमोक्रेसी है ही नहीं। और इसलिए जब आप डेमोक्रेसी कहते हैं, जब डेमोक्रेसी को स्वीकार करते हैं और जब हम डेमोक्रेसी को लेकर के जीते हैं, तब डिस्क्रिमिनेशन का कोई सवाल ही नहीं उठता है। और इसलिए भारत सबका साथ, सबका विकास, सबका विश्वास, सबका प्रयास, उन मूलभूत सिद्धांतों को लेकर के, और इसलिए हम चलते हैं। भारत में सरकार के जो बेनिफिट्स हैं वो एक्सेस टू ऑल है, जो भी उसके हकदार हैं उन सबको मिलते हैं। इसलिए भारत के लोकतांत्रिक मूल्यों में कोई भेदभाव नहीं है, न धर्म के आधार पर, न जाति के आधार पर, न उम्र के आधार पर, न भूभाग के आधार पर।
My question to you, Salvatore, before you get into what you thought of the Prime Minister's response is there a lesson here also for the Modi government and its fans? And is that lesson this, that you may not like this question about India's democratic record, you may not agree with it, but you cannot duck it. There is a narrative in large sections of the Western media, in several Western governments, and at home among many critics of the Modi government. And therefore, the approach thus far of the government to avoid this question, to not engage with it, to term those who pose it as anti-national, this too is flawed, because even at the most sort of glamorous ceremonial reception that you get in the most powerful country in the world, this question is going to follow you. So you need to start engaging with this question.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think the Indian government, from the standpoint of its international image, has done very poorly in public diplomacy, has done very poorly in presenting this message, whether it's the Prime Minister making, a very general statement, or Dr. Jaishankar making much more muscular statements. They've taken the line that has been adopted now by the United States government. They've taken the line that, it's wrong of you to criticize us. So we're not going to answer these criticisms. I think it would be much smarter for them, again, for public diplomacy purposes, to answer the criticisms. Instead, they seem to be playing for a domestic audience. And of course, they are politicians. So I understand why they would rather play to the domestic audience than try to give a specific rebuttal. But it's not very good for their public diplomacy efforts. I mean, look, the two questions asked by the Wall Street Journal reporter were about the human rights of Muslims and about freedom of speech in India. Now, on the human rights of Muslims, well, we have the data that 98% of Muslims in India say they're free to practice their religion. 98%. Now, Indians may not agree with that. Indians may think that's a false representation. Muslim leaders in India may say, no, that's false. I don't know what Indians may feel about that. That's the hard data. I mean, whether people like it or not, that's the hard data. From a top quality survey with a high response rate, with a large sample, that's the data. Now, why the Indian government doesn't respond with that, I don't know. I think it's a strategic mistake from the standpoint of public diplomacy. But that's really what we need to be talking about. Now, freedom of speech, it's hard to measure freedom of speech. As someone who watches the Indian media, at least the English language Indian media at length, I think there's extreme freedom of speech in India. But, that's a subjective judgment. But we can go to safety of journalists. journalists are safer in India. And again, it's data from the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is, if anything, an anti-Indian government activist organization. More journalists are killed in the United States on a per capita basis than in India.
Let me give you, since you mentioned free speech, data collated by a digital database, Article 14, and I'm quoting them here. They say that of 405 Indians who face sedition cases, right, between 2010 to 2021 for criticizing politicians and governments, 96% of these were registered after 2014. That's, of course, the year that the Modi government came to power. This is also data. This is the NCRB data that you also see on your screen right now. So if we're talking data, we also have to contextualize that India's Law Commission recently actually upheld only in a recommendation, only as a recommendation, that the sedition law should stay, even though there's a wide cross-party consensus building up that this law needs to be scrapped. So all I'm arguing, Salvatore, is that the democracy debate is a complex one. Democracies are imperfect. The American democracy is imperfect. The Indian democracy is imperfect. There are things wrong, and we shouldn't be defensive about discussing the things that are wrong.
Of course they are, and I doubly agree with you that nobody should try to be defensive about it. And I think the real problem for India's narrative is that Dr. Jaishankar and, to a lesser extent, Mr. Modi have been defensive about it instead of going on the offensive, instead of presenting the facts. So on sedition, we see these, and this is something I've been talking about again for a year now. On sedition, there is no trend in either the filing of sedition cases or in prosecutions over time. Yet if you strategically choose specific endpoints, you can make it look like there's a trend. Now, if you go, say, from the year 2000 to today, and you ask about the annual filing of FIRs for sedition, you find there's no trend. Per year, there's the same frequency of filing of sedition before and after 2014. Now, that's not a narrative anyone ever gets out because no one goes to the data. They go to an activist report. So the activist looks at the data, produces a report, and then journalists cite the activist report. But the activist is, of course, trying to find a way they can take that raw data, which I guarantee you show no trend. I can go through the data with you sometime. I'd love to show it to you. But the data show no trend. That's regardless of the fact of whether the cases are being filed by BJP governments or non-BJP. We don't have that data easily accessible. But the trend just isn't there unless you strategically choose particular endpoints that you can make it look like a trend. That is, you find the last year under which there were a large number of cases filed under UPA, and you go 1 year past that, right? And so you strategically find endpoints. But there's simply no trend in the data. This is something they should get out. I mean, if I can explain how this works, let me go to the most important data that's hurled in the United States, that's hurled against the Indian government. This is from the annual report of the US State Department's International Religious Freedom Report. Now, the International Religious Freedom Report has literally every year over 1,000 documentations of allegations of violence against Christians or crimes against Christians in India. Generally, there are fewer than 10 allegations of crimes against Muslims. Okay. Yet, when the narrative comes out from the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, they only cite that they give language along the lines of India faces, worsening problems of religious freedom. Muslims in India face discrimination. Now, that narrative that Muslims face discrimination, if you go back to the data, is actually based on more than 1,000 allegations of violations of Christians' rights. Yet, when the U.S. ambassador, appointed by Joe Biden, his ambassador at large for international religious freedom, gave his summary of the report, he only mentioned crimes against Muslims. Now, that narrative building is being driven by Muslim Americans, by international Islamist organizations, by activist organizations who feel they can weaponize the social exclusion of Muslims in India, who don't feel they can realistically weaponize the social exclusion of Christians. And so because they think they can get traction over it, they try to push that narrative. But when we go back to the data, it's just not there.
But no data, this way or that way, actually gives you texture. And when I talk about texture, I also think it's important for us to talk about rhetoric,
Sure.
hate-mongering, hate speech, inflammatory
Absolutely.
speeches, the talk of Hindutva, the talk of being, everyone in India should actually self-identify as Hindu culturally. And when the RSS chief said that, he then went on to say that it's a geographical reference point I'm making, not a religious one. I'm just saying all of this is also in the public discourse. But let's pick up another data point. Another data point is what's happening with non-governmental organizations, many of which have lost their registration because of the FCRA license. That's the right to get foreign funds. Now, this is a big talking point in India. The critics of the government say it has been weaponized against critics. How do you see this? And then after this, I want to go back to America, because we can have a longer debate about India's democracy another time. I want to go back to how you think the visit went, but let's pick this up as one talking point.
Sure. When I first entered Indian consciousness, let's say last November, the very first thing that critics did was look up anything they could find on me, and they found I had made a United States foreign influence registration. And then I told them, when the reporter called me, I said, yeah, I also have one in Australia, because I follow the law. I'm required to make a registration. Now, I made this registration despite not even knowing, actually precisely because I didn't know the source of the funds that were paying me. I wasn't sure whether they were private funds or government funds. I have no idea. So I do a registration just to be safe. It's the right thing to do, for $4,000, mind you. Tiny thing. It became national news in India, Salvatore Babones, foreign agent, because we follow the administrative requirements. Now, the FCRA, the only change that was made since 2014 was to add that the tax ID numbers, the national ID numbers of the officers of the charities have to register. Now, I have to register, and I'm just me, a professor getting $4,000. If you're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars of foreign money, yeah, you should have your accounting in order. You should have to register. You should have to put your name and ID number on that form, and not say, well, giving my ID number somehow doxes me or makes me. My name, address, and ID number on the form, and I'm just a guy on my own. These complaints that, well, having to put your name, address, and ID number and to be public about your disclose your finances, that's somehow repressing NGOs. Well, I'm sorry. In the West, we have to do this. In Australia, we have to do this. In the US, we have to do this. I see no real reason why in India you shouldn't have to do that. Now, we could question whether having to register foreign funds at all is the right thing in a democracy. But we should also accept, and I'm a comparativist here, I'm not an absolutist. Other countries do the same thing, and other countries, including the United States, prosecute people aggressively if they don't make in the US, their foreign influence registrations.
Like I said, we'll keep 60 minutes on another day, and we'll get into a lot of the debates in India. But let's come back in the last 2-3 minutes we have left here on the United States visit. And you said, and I found that interesting, you said actually you were disappointed that the Biden administration, you were disappointed, yeah? And what struck you was that you expected a more proactive defense by the Biden administration and its officials of India's democratic record. Is that what you're saying?
No, I expected a fact-based analysis.
Fact-based. Okay, let's talk about Obama for just a moment. There are two conspiracy theories about why Barack Obama said what he did to Christian Amanpour. I'm going to play that clip for just a second, and then we'll talk about that. Listen in.
If the president meets with Prime Minister Modi, then the protection of the Muslim minority in a majority Hindu India, that's something worth mentioning. Because, and by the way, if I had a conversation with Prime Minister Modi, who I know well, part of my argument would be that if you do not protect the rights of ethnic minorities in India, then there is a strong possibility India at some point starts pulling apart.
Now, there are two theories about why Obama said what he did. And before I ask you my question, I think it's worth reminding our audience that when Obama was president, he would not have made a comment like this, quite simply.
Well, he didn't make a
Secondly,
comment like that.
no, and no, I'm just saying he also profiled the Prime Minister for Time magazine, where he called him a reformer in chief. But there are two theories. One theory is that, Biden would not be happy with what Obama has said. The other theory is what Biden can't say in public, Obama is saying, and therefore now you can't ignore Obama. So, what do you think? Because this was probably the strongest statement made by anyone in the US who has been leading the country, that India could pull apart. Nobody has actually made that comment thus far. Salvatore.
Look, Barack Obama was simply reflecting the U.S. establishment consensus view on India. Now, of course, Joe Biden is not going to say something like that while he's hosting Narendra Modi. But nonetheless, I think there's a consensus around that view. I think that view is wrong. But there's a consensus. Look, I don't blame a Joe Biden or Barack Obama for merely reporting back what they're reading in the newspapers. If they read the New York Times and the Washington Post, they'll get a much more dim view of India even than that. If this is the Wall Street Journal view of India that Barack Obama is reporting. This is exactly what I read in the Wall Street Journal about India. And the Wall Street Journal is, relatively conservative, relatively in U.S. terms, pro-India newspaper. I don't blame a political leader for repeating back the consensus that they're getting from analysts and journalists. I blame the analysts and journalists. I blame the Jake Sullivans of the world, national security advisor, who are supposed to be abreast of these things and briefing their leaders on these things. The journalists in the United States simply aren't going to the American data. I want to stress that, the American data we have on India. Now, why they're not digging into it, I don't know. They're accepting the narrative that comes out of op-eds, the narratives that come from activists, the narratives that come from NGOs. I think they're expecting those NGOs to be the experts for them. But I'll tell you, a journalist can't take NGO accounts at face value. If you want to know what's really going on, you have to know that every NGO has a political axe to grind, and you have to go to the underlying data. So I don't blame Obama at all. And I want to tell Indians what Obama is saying. He's just telling you, he's accurately reflecting the broad consensus narrative of the American elite. I'm convinced that narrative is wrong, but I'm sorry to tell you that is the consensus.
And I just showed you three of those op-eds just earlier this morning, which actually pretty much capture what you're calling now the Washington consensus. In the end, what is your big takeaway from this trip? When you look at also the 12 standing ovations, the success of the Indian American community, the sort of business deals, the anti-China sort of anxiety on the Hill, for which there is, of course, bipartisan American support. That's one big part of the story. On the other hand is the 70 lawmakers who want Biden to say more on democracy, the Obama statement, the 3 or 4 lawmakers on the left who boycott that address. So there's both of this happening almost in parallel universes. What's the big takeaway? What really stood out for you in terms of what worked, and what stood out for you in terms of what did not work?
Look, there's an old quote in the United States, and forgive my language here, it's not my usual language, but saying of some leader in a country, I think it was Lyndon Johnson talking about the president of South Vietnam. Well, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. I don't think that's the right narrative to have for India. And I think that's what we saw in Washington. We saw an overwhelming diplomatic victory for India. Everyone is on India's side. But everyone is on India's side for the wrong reasons. They're on India's side because they think, well, India is a big economic opportunity. They're going to buy U.S. defense equipment. They're going to counter China. There's a sense that America is instrumentally using India for its own foreign policy agenda. That's the wrong narrative about India. The narrative we should be having about India is that India is the leading democracy of the developing world. And yes, we could always say yes, and there are problems, but yes, and there are problems apply to everywhere in the world. I mean, look at American democracy if you want to talk about problems with democracy. India does remarkably well, and that narrative did not come through on this trip. I didn't see a single op-ed defending India's record on human rights and democracy. All I saw were op-eds at best apologizing for India's record on democracy. That is saying that, well, there are criticisms, but really we should work with them anyway, instead of robustly rebutting those criticisms. And so I think diplomatically, overwhelming success. But from the standpoint of the image of Indian democracy in America, this was an enormous missed opportunity.
All right, we will leave it there. Salvatore Babones, always interesting to talk to you. I look forward to a deeper dive into many of the issues that we touched upon briefly, and we'll do that in the near future. Thank you so much. Take care, and thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We started Mojo right here in this basement. Just 4 people, 4. And now we're about to hit our first 1 million subscribers. So this is to say thank you to all of you for your support, for your respect, and for your encouragement. We've always gone to where the story is. During the pandemic, when television's big anchors were hunkered down in their studios or at their homes, we hit the road. We traveled from Delhi to Kerala, covering 30,000 kilometers in a small car, reporting from inside ICUs and inside slum tenements. Whether it's flash floods or war zones, we've always put our boots on the ground. In fact, we're just back from Punjab, tailing the Khalistani fugitive Amritpal Singh. And through all of this, we have always put you, the people, first. In an age of partisan polarized media where most journalists are either chamcha ya morcha, we believe the story is sacred and the truth of the story is what matters. And now as we get ready for the next step, we need your help. Become a Mojo member and get first access to all our big interviews. Get a chance to ask our newsmakers questions. Get a chance to write and report for us for both our website and our channels. And also, interact with me and my colleagues directly through AMA sessions. Literally, ask me anything. Click on the join now right next to the subscribe button, and yes, also subscribe if you haven't yet, and become a Mojo member for just 159 rupees a month. Hope to see lots of you in our community.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.